It was well past midnight when I noticed her phone light up on the nightstand. I should have ignored it, should have let it be, but something in my gut twisted. Amy had been distant lately, always preoccupied, glued to her phone more often than usual. I reached over and picked it up. One swipe was all it took to shatter my world. Can't stop thinking about last night. Meet me again tomorrow? The message was from David Lanes, her colleague, the guy she'd mentioned in passing a few times but never in a way that raised any alarms. Now, the alarms were blaring, loud and clear. My heart pounded in my chest as I read the message again, hoping I had misunderstood, that maybe it was a joke or some terrible mistake. But there was no mistaking the tone, no denying the betrayal staring back at me from that screen. I didn't wake her up. Not then. Instead, I set the phone back down quietly and left the room. My hands were trembling as I poured myself a glass of water in the kitchen, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. The betrayal, the lies, it was all too much to process. But the anger? That was sharp and clear. I wasn't going to let this destroy me. If Amy wanted to throw away our marriage for a fling with some slick-talking colleague, that was on her. But I wasn't going to just sit back and let it happen. No, I had a different plan in mind. The next morning, I could barely keep my anger in check as I sat across from Amy at the breakfast table. She was scrolling through her phone, oblivious to the storm brewing inside me. I waited until she set it down and looked up at me with a soft smile, the same smile that had once made me fall for her. But now, all I saw was deceit. "Amy," I said, my voice tight. "Who's David Lanes to you?" The color drained from her face. For a moment, she was silent, her eyes wide with shock. Then, she tried to compose herself, but the damage was already done. She stammered, "He's just a colleague." "Why?" I leaned forward, my gaze never leaving hers. "Don't lie to me, Amy. I saw the message. I know what's been going on." Her defenses crumbled. She started to cry, which only fueled my anger more. "Jack, I'm sorry. It was a mistake. I didn't mean for this to happen." I stood up, unable to stay seated any longer. "A mistake? How long has this been going on?" "A few months," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But it didn't mean anything." "I swear, it didn't." "It didn't mean anything?" I repeated, incredulous. "You're sleeping with another man, and it doesn't mean anything?" She tried to reach for me, but I stepped back, shaking my head. "I need to get out of here," I said, grabbing my keys. "I can't deal with this right now." I left before she could say anything else, slamming the door behind me. As I drove aimlessly through the quiet streets, the pain and betrayal started to harden into something else: resolve. If David Lanes thought he could have an affair with my wife and get away with it, he was sorely mistaken. This wasn't just about Amy anymore. This was about taking control of the situation. About not letting someone else dictate the terms of my life. And I had the skills to make that happen. It was time to turn the tables. I spent the rest of the day driving around aimlessly, trying to clear my head. But no matter where I went, the thoughts followed me: Amy, David, the betrayal. It was like a poison in my veins, eating away at everything I thought I knew. By the time I pulled into the parking lot of my office, the sun was already sinking low on the horizon. I hadn't planned on going to work that day. But sitting around doing nothing was unbearable. Maybe losing myself in work would help dull the pain. As I sat at my desk, staring blankly at the stack of financial reports in front of me, a new thought started to take shape. I'd spent years honing my skills as a financial analyst, learning how to spot discrepancies and how to dig deeper when something didn't add up. That's what I did for a living: expose the truth hidden beneath layers of numbers. What if I applied those skills to David? I knew where he worked and what position he held. It wouldn't be hard to dig into his financials, to see if he had anything to hide. The idea of uncovering something that could bring him down felt like a lifeline, a way to take control when everything else seemed to be spiraling. I opened my laptop and started my search. It began innocently enough, just looking up basic information, trying to get a sense of who David Lanes really was. But the more I dug, the more intrigued I became. His name popped up in some questionable business deals, transactions that didn't quite make sense. And that's when I knew I was onto something. I spent hours combing through financial records, public filings, and anything I could get my hands on. And then, finally, there it was, a trail of suspicious activity. Money moving through accounts in a way that reeked of embezzlement and tax evasion. David Lanes wasn't just a cheating scumbag. He was a criminal. I leaned back in my chair, a grim smile forming on my lips. I had him. Now, all I had to do was figure out the best way to use this information. This wasn't just about getting back at him for the affair anymore. This was about taking him down, about showing him that actions have consequences. And if it meant that Amy got caught up in the fallout? So be it. She made her choice. Now, it was time for me to make mine. The next few days were a blur of planning and preparation. I knew that confronting David directly wouldn't accomplish anything. No, this needed to be handled delicately, with precision. I had to make sure that when the authorities came knocking, there was no way for him to wriggle out of it. I gathered every piece of evidence I could find, making sure to document each step carefully. There were bank statements, wire transfers, and even some correspondence that hinted at larger crimes. The deeper I went, the more satisfying it became. It was like piecing together a puzzle, and with every new connection, I felt more in control. But as I built my case against David, I also had to confront Amy. I couldn't avoid her forever, and she deserved to know what was coming. I didn't do it out of kindness, more out of a sense of finality. This was the end of whatever we had, and she needed to understand that. One evening, I found her sitting in the living room, staring blankly at the TV. She looked up as I walked in, her eyes puffy from crying. There was no anger left in me when I saw her like that, just a cold, detached resolve. "We need to talk," I said, sitting down across from her. She nodded, not saying a word. I could see the guilt weighing on her. But I didn't care anymore. I found out some things about David, I began, keeping my tone even. Things that could ruin him. He's involved in illegal activities, and I've gathered enough evidence to bring him down. Her eyes widened, and a mix of fear and confusion flashed across her face. "Jack, you can't." "I can," I interrupted. "And I will. I've already contacted a lawyer, and the authorities will be getting this information soon. David's going to face the consequences of his actions. She looked like she wanted to argue, to plead with me, but I held up a hand to stop her. "This isn't just about you and him anymore, Amy. This is about justice. And honestly, it's about me taking control of my life again. You made your choices. Now, I'm making mine." She slumped back onto the couch, defeated. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. "I'm filing for divorce," I said, the words feeling final and irrevocable. "I can't stay in this marriage, not after everything that's happened. I'll be moving out soon, and after that, who knows?" Amy didn't argue. She just nodded, tears silently streaming down her face. But I didn't feel pity or sadness, just a sense of closure. This chapter of my life was over, and I was ready to move on. As I walked out of the room, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. The trap was set, and all I had to do was wait for it to spring. David Lanes would get what was coming to him, and Amy, well, she would have to live with the consequences of her actions. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe again. The day I sent the anonymous tip to the authorities was just like any other. The sun was shining, people were going about their lives, and yet, for me, everything had shifted. I walked into my office, sat down at my desk, and with a few keystrokes, set the wheels in motion that would destroy David Lanes. I had crafted the email carefully, making sure there were no traces back to me. The evidence was attached in a neat, organized file: bank statements, financial records, and emails. All of it laid out so clearly that even the most incompetent investigator would have no trouble connecting the dots. As I hit send, a strange calm settled over me. This wasn't revenge, not exactly. It was justice. David had taken something from me, my marriage, my trust, and now I was taking something from him. It was as simple as that. The next few days were a waiting game. I went through the motions at work, half expecting the authorities to show up at any moment. But there was nothing. No signs of panic from David, no whispers of an impending investigation. It was almost as if the world was holding its breath, waiting for the storm to break. At home, things were tense but quiet. Amy and I barely spoke. She knew something was coming, but she didn't ask for details. We were two strangers living under the same roof, each waiting for the inevitable end. And then, it happened. It was a Friday afternoon when I got the news. I was at my desk, wrapping up for the day when a colleague mentioned it in passing. "Did you hear about David Lanes? There's some kind of investigation going on at his firm. FBI agents showed up this morning." I kept my face neutral, nodding along as if it were just another piece of office gossip. Inside, though, I felt a surge of satisfaction. The trap had sprung. By the time I got home, the news had spread. Amy was sitting on the couch, pale and shaken. She looked up at me as I walked in, her eyes filled with fear. "They're investigating David," she whispered. "He called me. He's terrified, Jack." I didn't say anything. I just stood there, letting her words hang in the air between us. "What did you do?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I did what needed to be done," I replied, my tone cold. "He's not just a cheater, Amy. He's a criminal. And now he's going to pay for it." She stared at me, tears welling up in her eyes. "Jack, I never wanted this. You made your choice," I said, cutting her off. "Now you have to live with the consequences." There was nothing left to say. I turned and walked out of the room, leaving her to deal with the fallout. The satisfaction I'd felt earlier was fading, replaced by a deep, lingering emptiness. But I didn't regret what I'd done. Not for a second. The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity. David Lane's name was all over the news, front-page headlines, news broadcasts, online articles. His fall from grace was swift and brutal. The investigation uncovered more than I had anticipated, leading to multiple charges that would likely send him to prison for years. Amy was devastated. She tried to reach out to David, but he was in too deep to offer her any comfort. Their affair, which had once seemed so thrilling and secretive, was now just a reminder of the destruction they had caused. I focused on the practicalities, getting my life in order, and preparing for the next steps. The divorce papers were drawn up quickly. I didn't want anything from her, just a clean break. Amy didn't fight it. She knew she had no ground to stand on. The day we met with the lawyers to finalize everything, she looked like a ghost of the woman I had once known. Her hair was unkempt, her eyes hollow. She sat across from me in the sterile conference room, unable to meet my gaze. "Jack," she started, her voice barely audible. "I'm so sorry for everything." I nodded but didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. We signed the papers in silence, and just like that, our marriage was over. As I left the office, I felt a strange mix of emotions, relief, sadness, and a glimmer of hope. This chapter of my life was finally behind me. And for the first time in a long while, the future didn't seem so bleak. I returned home to pack the last of my things. The house was eerily quiet, filled with memories that I no longer had any attachment to. Amy wasn't there, she had gone to stay with a friend. I didn't mind. It made leaving easier. As I loaded the last box into my car, I took one final look at the house, the place where I had once imagined building a life, a future. But now, it was just a structure, an empty shell. I turned away and drove off, leaving it all behind. My new life was waiting for me in another city, far from the ghosts of my past. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing for certain: I was ready to face it on my own terms. The new city felt like a different world. The air was cleaner, the streets unfamiliar, and the people didn't carry the weight of my past in their eyes. It was exactly what I needed: a fresh start, where no one knew my story, my mistakes, or my scars. I'd found a small apartment in a quiet neighborhood. It wasn't much, but it was mine. The space was modest and sparsely furnished, but it felt like freedom. I spent the first few days settling in, unpacking boxes, and trying to make it feel like home. The solitude was both comforting and unnerving, but I knew it was part of the process. I had to learn how to be on my own again. Work was different, too. I had switched industries entirely, moving away from the world of finance that had once defined me. Now, I am working for a nonprofit organization that focuses on urban development. The job wasn't glamorous, and the pay was a step down from what I was used to, but it felt right. For the first time in years, I wasn't just chasing numbers, I was doing something that mattered. My new colleagues were welcoming, though they didn't pry too much into my past. I appreciated that. They didn't know about Amy or David, and I had no intention of sharing that part of my life. Here, I was just Jack, the new guy with a quiet determination and a desire to make a difference. One evening, after a particularly long day at the office, I found myself walking through a local park. The sun was setting, casting a warm golden light over everything. It was peaceful, and for the first time in a long while, I felt a sense of contentment. As I sat down on a bench, watching the world go by, I realized that I wasn't angry anymore. The bitterness, the betrayal, it was still there, but it didn't consume me like it used to. I had survived the worst of it, and now, I was ready to start living again. That's when I met Claire. She was sitting on the next bench over, reading a book and occasionally glancing up at the people passing by. She had a calm presence about her, the kind of quiet confidence that drew you in without being overpowering. We struck up a conversation, nothing deep, just small talk about the weather, the park, and the book she was reading. But as we talked, I found myself genuinely interested in what she had to say. She was smart, thoughtful, and funny in a subtle, unassuming way. It wasn't anything like what I had felt with Amy. This was different, simpler, and more honest. As the sun dipped below the horizon, we exchanged numbers, promising to meet up again. It wasn't a grand, sweeping moment, but it felt good. Maybe this was what I needed, a new connection, something untainted by the past. I walked back to my apartment that night feeling lighter than I had in months. The future was still uncertain. But for the first time, it didn't scare me. I was ready for whatever came next. A few weeks had passed since I met Claire, and life was slowly starting to take on a new rhythm. We had met up a few more times, coffee, a walk in the park, a casual dinner. It was all very low-key, and that was exactly what I needed. She didn't push for more than I was willing to give, and I appreciated that. Work was going well, too. I was finding purpose in the projects I was involved in, helping to revitalize neglected parts of the city, and working with people who genuinely cared about making a difference. It wasn't the high-stakes world of finance, but it was fulfilling in a way that numbers and charts never could be. But just as I started to feel like I was finally leaving my old life behind, the past came knocking. It started with a phone call. I didn't recognize the number, but something made me answer it anyway. "Jack, it's Amy." Her voice hit me like a punch to the gut. I hadn't heard from her since the divorce was finalized, and I wasn't sure I wanted to hear from her now. But before I could say anything, she continued, "I'm in town. I need to talk to you." I hesitated, my mind racing. What could she possibly want after all this time? Curiosity got the better of me, and I agreed to meet her at a cafe the next day. When I walked in, I spotted her immediately. She looked different, thinner, more worn down. Life had clearly taken its toll on her, and for a brief moment, I felt a pang of sympathy. But then I remembered everything that had happened, and that sympathy quickly turned to steel. We exchanged awkward pleasantries, and then she got to the point. "I'm sorry for everything, Jack. I know I can't undo what I did, but I needed to tell you that I regret it, every single day." I nodded, unsure of what to say. Her apology felt sincere, but it didn't change the past. "David's in prison," she continued. "And I lost everything. My job, my reputation. I don't even know who I am anymore." I looked at her, searching for any sign of the woman I used to love. But all I saw was someone broken, someone who had been crushed by her own decisions. And as much as I wanted to feel something, pity, anger, sadness, I felt nothing. "I'm not sure why you're telling me this, Amy," I said finally. "Our lives, they've moved on. I'm not the person you knew, and you're not the person I thought you were." She nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "I know. I guess I needed to say it out loud. To face you and admit that I was wrong." I leaned back in my chair, letting her words sink in. "I appreciate the apology, but I don't think there's anything left for us to discuss. We're different people now, and I've made peace with what happened. You should try to do the same." She wiped her eyes, trying to hold herself together. "You're right. I'm sorry for bringing all of this up again." We sat in silence for a moment, and then she stood up to leave. I watched her go, feeling a strange sense of closure. This was the final piece of the puzzle, the last lingering thread of my old life. Now severed. As I walked out of the cafe, I pulled out my phone and sent Claire a message. I wasn't going to let the past hold me back any longer. I had a new life now, and it was time to fully embrace it. After meeting with Amy, I expected to feel more, something dramatic or at least emotionally significant. But the truth was, I didn't. It was like shutting the door on an empty room. There was no noise, no echo, just a quiet closure. And in a way, that felt like a victory. The storm that had once raged inside me had finally passed, leaving behind calm waters. I texted Claire that night, and we ended up meeting for dinner at a cozy little Italian restaurant. The conversation flowed easily, and I found myself laughing more than I had in months. Claire had a way of making everything feel light, as if the world didn't have to be so heavy all the time. She didn't ask about my past, and I didn't volunteer any information. We were focused on the present, on getting to know each other without the baggage of what had come before. At one point during dinner, she looked at me with a playful glint in her eye. "So, Jack, what's next for you? What's the grand plan?" I smiled, considering the question. It was a good one. For so long, my life had been about reacting, dealing with the fallout of Amy's affair, the divorce, and starting over. I hadn't really thought about what came next. I'm not sure, I admitted. For now, I'm just trying to enjoy the moment. Maybe that's the plan, just to take things as they come and see where they lead. She nodded thoughtfully. That sounds like a good plan. Life's too short to try and control everything. Sometimes, you just have to let it unfold. As the night wore on, I found myself opening up to her in small ways. Nothing too deep, but enough to let her see that I wasn't just some guy who had it all figured out. I had my flaws, my insecurities, my doubts. And she seemed to accept that without judgment, which was something I hadn't realized I needed. When we finally said goodnight, there was an unspoken understanding between us. We were both cautious, both a little guarded, but there was potential here, something worth exploring. As I walked back to my apartment, I realized that for the first time in a long while, I wasn't looking over my shoulder. I wasn't haunted by the past, nor was I anxiously trying to control the future. I was just here, in the present, and that felt like enough. Weeks turned into months, and slowly, my new life began to take shape. Work at the nonprofit became more fulfilling as I got involved in larger projects, helping to renovate old buildings, create community spaces, and make a tangible difference in the city. It wasn't the high-powered, fast-paced world of finance, but it was rewarding in ways I hadn't expected. Claire and I continued to see each other regularly. Our relationship progressed naturally, without any pressure to define it or rush into anything serious. We enjoyed each other's company, supported each other's goals, and found a balance that worked for both of us. It wasn't perfect, no relationship is, but it was real. And that was enough for me. One afternoon, as we were walking through a local art gallery, Claire turned to me with a thoughtful expression. "You know, Jack, I've been thinking. You're really good at what you do with the nonprofit. Have you ever considered starting something of your own? Like a project or a business that combines your financial skills with your passion for helping people?" The idea took me by surprise. I hadn't thought about starting something on my own, not since the divorce. But as she spoke, I realized that maybe it was time to start thinking bigger, to stop playing it safe. "What would that look like?" I asked, genuinely curious. She smiled, clearly excited by the possibilities. "I don't know exactly, but maybe something like a social enterprise, a business that's profitable but also gives back to the community. You could use your skills to help people manage their finances, invest in sustainable projects, or even provide affordable housing. The sky's the limit, really." The idea sparked something in me, something I hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of purpose beyond just surviving. Maybe she was right. Maybe it was time to stop playing small and start building something that truly mattered. Over the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I started jotting down ideas, making rough sketches of business plans, and talking to people in the industry who could give me advice. The more I explored the concept, the more excited I became. This was something I could sink my teeth into, something that combined my old skills with my new passion. Claire was my sounding board through it all, offering encouragement and practical suggestions without pushing too hard. She believed in me, and that belief gave me the confidence to move forward. One evening, as we sat on my balcony overlooking the city, I turned to her and said, "I think I'm going to do it. I'm going to start something of my own." She smiled, her eyes lighting up with pride. "I knew you would. You're too smart and too driven to settle for anything less." As I looked out at the city lights, I realized how far I had come since that fateful day when I first discovered Amy's betrayal. Life had thrown me off course and shattered everything I thought I knew, but somehow, I had found my way back. Not to the life I had before, but to something new, something better. This was my life now, unpredictable, messy, and full of potential. And for the first time in a long time, I was ready to embrace whatever came next. The decision to start my own venture felt both exhilarating and terrifying. I was stepping into the unknown once again, but this time, it was on my terms. Claire had been right. I had more to offer than I'd allowed myself to believe. I spent the next few weeks refining my ideas, speaking with potential partners, and outlining a business plan that balanced profitability with social impact. The concept was simple: a financial consulting firm focused on community development. We would work with local businesses and residents to create sustainable economic opportunities. Whether it was helping small businesses secure funding, offering financial literacy workshops, or investing in affordable housing projects. The goal was to uplift the community while making a solid return. As the pieces started coming together, I began reaching out to former colleagues and connections. To my surprise, many of them were eager to support the venture, offering advice, resources, and even funding. It was a reminder that my past experience wasn't something to discard. It was a foundation I could build on. Claire was there every step of the way, providing encouragement and practical insights. Her background in marketing was invaluable as we worked on branding and outreach strategies. We spent late nights brainstorming, refining ideas, and envisioning what this new business could become. One evening, as we sat together in my living room, surrounded by papers and laptops, she looked at me with a grin. "You know, Jack, I think you found your calling." I chuckled, feeling a warmth spread through me. "It certainly feels that way. I never thought I'd be excited about work again, but here we are." She leaned closer, her expression serious now. "You're doing something important. You're not just rebuilding your life. You're helping others do the same." That's powerful. Her words stayed with me, fueling my drive to make this venture a success. It wasn't just about proving something to myself anymore, it was about making a difference. Both for me and for the people I aimed to help. As the launch date approached, I felt a mixture of excitement and nerves. The business was coming together, and we had our first clients lined up. Everything was falling into place, and yet, there was a part of me that couldn't shake the fear of failure. What if this didn't work? What if I was making a mistake? But every time doubt crept in, Claire was there to remind me of why I was doing this. "You've already been through the worst, Jack," she would say. "This is your chance to rise above it. Don't be afraid to take it." And so, with her words in my heart, I took the leap. We officially launched the business with a small event at a local community center. It wasn't flashy, but it felt right, intimate, genuine, and full of promise. As I stood in front of the modest crowd, speaking about our mission and vision, I realized that I was no longer the man who had been broken by betrayal. I was someone new, stronger, wiser, and ready to face whatever challenges came next. The months following the launch were a whirlwind. The business quickly gained traction, and soon, we were juggling multiple projects. I found myself busier than I had ever been, but it was a good kind of busy, one filled with purpose and momentum. We worked with small businesses to help them grow, provided financial education to those who had never had access to it before, and even partnered with local government initiatives to revitalize neglected neighborhoods. Every day brought new challenges, but also new rewards. Seeing the tangible impact of our work on the community was more fulfilling than I could have imagined. Claire continued to be my rock through it all. We grew closer as we navigated this new chapter of our lives together. Our relationship, which had started with cautious optimism, blossomed into something deeper and more meaningful. She wasn't just my partner in business, she had become my partner in life. One weekend, we took a trip out of the city, to a small cabin in the woods. It was a chance to disconnect from the chaos of work and just enjoy each other's company. As we sat by the fire one evening, sipping wine and listening to the crackling of the flames, Claire turned to me with a thoughtful expression. "Do you ever think about where you were a year ago?" she asked quietly. I nodded, staring into the fire. "All the time. It feels like a different lifetime. Sometimes I can't believe how much has changed." She smiled softly. "You've come so far, Jack. I'm proud of you." Her words brought a lump to my throat. "I couldn't have done it without you," I admitted. "You've been there for me in ways I didn't even realize I needed." She reached over and took my hand, squeezing it gently. "We've been there for each other. That's what makes this work." As we sat there, in the warmth of the fire and the quiet of the woods, I realized how true her words were. Life had thrown me off course, but I had found my way back, not alone, but with someone who believed in me just as much as I was learning to believe in myself. The past no longer held power over me. The pain and betrayal that had once defined me were now just memories, distant and fading. I had built something new, something strong, meaningful, and full of potential. As we looked up at the stars that night, I knew that whatever the future held, I was ready for it. With Claire by my side and a new purpose guiding me, I had finally found my way forward. The journey had been long and difficult, but it had led me here, to a place where I could finally say, with certainty, that I was happy. And that was more than enough. Life had settled into a steady rhythm, work, time with Claire, and a growing sense of fulfillment in the choices I had made. The business was thriving, and every day brought new opportunities to make a difference. But just as I started to feel like I had everything under control, a new challenge emerged. It began with a phone call from one of our major clients. They were a local business that we had helped secure funding for a community project. Things had been progressing smoothly, but now, out of the blue, they were facing a financial crisis. Their main investor had pulled out, leaving them in a precarious position. If they couldn't secure new funding soon, the project, and the business itself, might collapse. I spent hours on the phone, trying to find a solution. I called in favors, reached out to potential investors, and even considered using my own savings to keep the project afloat. But every avenue seemed to hit a dead end. It was like watching something you had carefully built begin to crumble, and I felt helpless to stop it. Claire noticed the strain it was putting on me. One evening, after a particularly grueling day, she sat me down and asked, "What's really going on, Jack? You've been distant lately." I sighed, running a hand through my hair. "It's this project. We've put so much into it, and now it's on the verge of falling apart. I feel responsible, like I've failed them, and us." She listened quietly, then took my hand. "You haven't failed, Jack. You're doing everything you can, but sometimes things don't work out the way we want them to. That doesn't mean you've failed." Her words were comforting, but they didn't erase the weight I was carrying. I had poured so much into this business, and the thought of losing it, or failing the people who were counting on me, was almost unbearable. But Claire's support gave me the strength to keep fighting. Together, we brainstormed new strategies, re-evaluated our options, and looked for creative solutions. It wasn't easy, and there were days when I wondered if we were just delaying the inevitable. But giving up wasn't an option. Not now, not after everything we had worked for. In the end, it came down to a last-minute breakthrough. One of our former clients, impressed by what we had done for them, agreed to step in as an investor. It wasn't enough to solve all the problems, but it was a lifeline, enough to keep the project going and buy us time to stabilize the situation. The relief I felt was immense, but so was the exhaustion. I realized that this was the reality of running a business. There would always be challenges, setbacks, and moments of doubt. But as long as I had the support of people like Claire, I knew I could face them. As we celebrated the small victory that night, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about the business. It was about resilience, about learning to navigate the ups and downs with grace. And with Claire by my side, I knew I could handle whatever came next. The crisis with the project had been a wake-up call, reminding me that even in this new life, nothing was guaranteed. But it also showed me how far I had come. A year ago, a setback like this might have sent me spiraling. Now, it was just another challenge to overcome. As the weeks passed, things began to stabilize. The project regained its footing, and the business continued to grow. We even started expanding our services, taking on new clients, and exploring opportunities in other cities. It was an exciting time, but it also meant more responsibility and more pressure. Yet, instead of feeling overwhelmed, I felt invigorated. This was what I had worked for, building something meaningful, something that could withstand the storms. Claire and I continued to grow closer as well. Our relationship had deepened into something solid and lasting, built on trust and mutual respect. We talked about the future, about what we wanted, and where we saw ourselves in the years to come. For the first time, I allowed myself to think about long-term plans, about building a life together that went beyond just surviving the present. One evening, after a particularly productive day at the office, Claire surprised me with a small celebration. She had cooked dinner, something she rarely did, given our busy schedules, and had even lit candles on the table. As we sat down to eat, I couldn't help but smile at the effort she had put into making the evening special. "What's the occasion?" I asked, genuinely curious. She grinned, pouring us both a glass of wine. "No occasion. I just wanted to celebrate us. Everything we've accomplished, everything we've been through. I'm proud of you, Jack. And I'm proud of us." Her words hit me deeply, more than I expected. I raised my glass, clinking it gently against her.